It was another long night. The cornfields burned for most of it. The camp remained on high alert as the fires lit up the fields under the cover of moonlight. Billy and I had a long talk throughout the night. He admitted he couldn't make the difficult decisions, but he wanted to save face for everyone else that remained at Wood Creek. We came to the agreement that I would lead and make the calls behind the scenes, and Billy would act like he was still running the show. My first decision was to scrap the ridiculous rule of not being armed. If you had a firearm, you were expected to carry it everywhere you went. Anyone that wasn't armed and was able-bodied was put on wood assembly. We needed all the wood we could gather and process for the ever-approaching winter. By first daybreak, I had estimated we'd lost roughly 75% of our corn crops. A small group of a dozen or so was able to harvest a few hundred ears yesterday before the intentional fire was set. Until Ridge Creek is terminated, there was no more jukebox and video games. I wasn't fond of Nate, but he was the best recon runner we had. We loaded him up with comms and gear, sent him off to gather any information on Ridge Creek he could. Not only would we have armed patrol atop the campers at both entrances, we'd also have a 24/7 patrol throughout the interior of Wood Creek. It was time to use the electric golf carts for something more than Billy's personal transportation. Anyone who wasn't able to be part of the wood assembly group was going to be given fishing poles and was expected to catch dinner for us. We'd wait for Nate to return with any intel he gathered before mounting a retaliatory strike. I didn't want to blindly send a group on a suicide mission if I could all but help it. I had all the volunteers that were willing to fight meet me at my cabin to divide up the extra firearms I had acquired. This was something you would never have expected to do 2 months ago. You could have went to prison for this type of thing, giving firearms and ammunition to people you didn't even know. Times have changed, and you now did whatever was needed in order to survive and live another day. I had 8 people show up, only 5 firearms to give away. I was keeping my AR, my Mossberg 500, and a 9mm. My wife was keeping the second AR I had come across weeks ago. I decided to do a vetting process, went with the most experienced shooters out of the 8. I had an abundance still of 12 gauge, 223 and 5.56. Less than 500 rounds of 9mm that Jack had stored in his house. The Mosin Nagant only had 2 rounds left. I chose the most experienced because we couldn't afford to waste ammo on training. We now had 5 more members of our group armed. What I had kept to myself was the 1 remaining grenade I had left. That had the potential to be a game changer when we invaded Ridge Creek. Billy and I gathered at the rec hall awaiting any word from Nate so we could devise a plan. Billy thanked me for stepping up, being the leader this campsite had desperately needed. I explained to him I'd already lost too many, and those were just the ones I know of. The majority of my family and friends, I still had no idea if they were alive or possibly dead by now. Billy had no siblings. His parents dedicated the majority of their lives to Wood Creek, foregoing on any more children. His mother, Mrs. Eddy, had lived to 93 years old before being killed in cold blood during the original attack from Ridge Creek. She now rested peacefully next to the house she had lived at for 7 decades. Nate had finally radioed and made contact with us. The connection wasn't clear. The 2 miles plus the tall pine trees were stretching the limit on my Baofeng walkies. "Nate, come in again. You're breaking up," I said. Billy and I listened closely with anticipation on channel 22, the same channel I ran with Joe. Nate's voice once again cut in and out. It was increasingly difficult to make out anything he was saying. "Damn it," I said. "We got to get closer to him to make anything out. We both ran out towards the entrance to stand atop the campers blocking our entrance. It was about a quarter-mile run, and the static continued to cut Nate's voice off. The armed guards, seeing us approaching, had no idea why we were running towards them. I climbed up the ladder and began calling out to Nate. "Nate, do you copy? Nate, copy." That's when I heard a gunshot go off in the distance, and at the same time heard it loud and clear over the walkie. I presumed Nate had just been executed. A voice came over the walkie and said, "You're now down to 54. I was shocked at that response. "How does he know the exact number of people at our camp?" Billy asked. "There's only one way," I replied. "We've got a spy inside our camp." That's when my heart sank. I had just given firearms to 5 people less than an hour ago. Could I have given the informant one of our guns? Nate was most likely dead, and we had a traitor among us. This was not how this mission was supposed to end. I told Billy we need to figure out who the snake is immediately before we lose more people. I asked if he had a list of everyone who was still here at Wood Creek. "No," he said. "I hadn't really thought of that. Minus Billy and my family, that put the number of possibilities at 48. 16 children minus my 3 was 13. I highly doubted any of them were our spy. The number of possibilities now dropped to 35. We next had to figure out how many of those were seasonal campers. We could probably eliminate them too. I radioed my wife, told her to be on guard. We've got a Ridge Creek member inside our perimeter, and they may be armed. "Get you and the girls into the cabin right now," I yelled. "I'm on my way, and we'll be there in minutes. Billy, I have to get to my family. We can figure this out once we get to my place and I know they're safe. If you need to sound the air horn, put Wood Creek in lockdown and have everyone shelter in place until we figure out who we're looking for." As Billy made his way into the general store to sound the alarm, gunshots began to echo out through the woods. My wife called out over the radio that she couldn't find Alicia. "Where was she last?" I asked. "She was on her way up to the store less than 5 minutes ago." "Stay inside the cabin. I'll find her," I said. I handed Billy my sidearm, said, "Alicia's missing. Let's go." I had counted 6 gunshots being fired. We had no choice but to head directly towards the area they were coming from. Halfway down the path, I seen Alicia's body laying in the gravel. I raced over to her now lifeless body, letting my guard down completely. She had suffered a single round directly in the head. There was a 9mm casing on the ground next to her. She was shot at extremely close range, execution style. I'd given 2 handguns away that morning, one to a male named Shane and one to a female named Karen. "Had to be one of those 2, I said to Billy. I heard 2 more rounds go off. I witnessed Billy fall to the ground beside me. A 3rd shot struck me in the back left shoulder. I fell forward onto Alicia's dead body, trying to turn around and draw my AR on the shooter. A 4th shot rang out. Finally, the shooter was put down. Daryl, our comms guy, and the one who got the arcade games and the jukebox working, had fired a single .308 round from his Savage Access hunting rifle. The shooter was Karen, the only female who had stepped forward and volunteered this morning. She killed Billy, Alicia, and shot me with the Glock 17 I had given her. Daryl said there's more. She killed 3 others and wounded 1. "Let me have a look at your shoulder," he said. I didn't feel an exit wound on the front side. Daryl said I was lucky. It had ricocheted off my shoulder blade. It hurt like hell to move. I couldn't help but feel responsible for the attack. I had fired on the thieves in the cornfield. I'd sent Nate to do the recon work, and I had stupidly given the firearm to Karen that was responsible for killing 5 and wounding 2. My wife and 2 daughters had now come out and made their way across the bridge to me. My oldest collapsed at the sight of her best friend dead. My wife and youngest hugged me tight before consoling Desiree. Wood Creek was in complete chaos and carnage. Billy was gone, succumbing to the same fate his mother had just over a week ago. More screams let out, and I had no idea what it could possibly be now. They were coming from the bridge, just a short distance away. Nate's body had been sent downstream from Ridge Creek. Daryl fished it out, and when he turned it over, both of his eyes had been removed. There was a piece of wood nailed to his chest that read, "We don't like wandering eyes." Wood Creek was left in shambles from the previous day's attack. I had used some cayenne pepper to stop the bleeding from my gunshot wound. My wife had tied a few shirts together to make a makeshift sling for my left arm. Daryl had pulled the group together to help bury Bill and the 4 other deceased members. Billy was laid to rest on his property directly next to the still fresh grave of his mother, Mrs. Eddy. Nate and the 3 others were buried by the rec hall with the previous deceased bodies. Wood Creek was fast running out of room to bury our dead. The 3 others who were murdered happened to live in the camper next to Karen's. Andy, Ann, and their son Alan were their names, the Johnsons. They were seasonal campers who would come up every spring from Florida to escape the oppressive heat. Each October, they'd head back down and spend the winters down south. My family decided to bury Alicia next to our cabin. My wife and kids were still devastated with her death. She had been best friends with my oldest for 4 years, practically lived at our house every weekend before Armageddon had initiated. I had failed at protecting her. My confidence and demeanor were shaken. Maybe I wasn't meant to lead Wood Creek. It seemed since I arrived, things had gone severely downhill for this group. Daryl had told us Karen was the last person to arrive at Wood Creek before my family showed up. She arrived 12 days prior to us. Mrs. Eddy and Billy had no reservations about letting her join the camp. She told them she had left her abusive husband, as she feared even more for her life now, with no law enforcement. The Eddys bought her story, hook, line, and sinker. Her being an informant for Ridge Creek helped explain why they were always one step ahead of us. I wondered why she'd blown her cover all of a sudden, shooting 7 of us and killing 5. I couldn't help but wonder if she was the only seed Ridge Creek planted in our group. I got the feeling she alerted her group to Nate's mission as well, resulting in his demise. A search of her camper resulted in no clues, no written notes, no communication devices, nothing that would have tipped us off to her horrific plans. I could only assume she was sneaking out for a rendezvous with whoever was leading Ridge Creek. Ridge Creek was at a strategic advantage being upstream from us. If they sent Nate's dead body downstream to us, I couldn't imagine what else they were dumping in the creek. I knew we needed to retaliate, but truth is, I was in no condition. The only thing I could shoot one-handed was a pistol. The pain was too much to rack my Mossberg. Without a rest, the AR-15 wouldn't be much better. I needed some time to heal up, but I wasn't sure we had that luxury. Our community was now under 50 people. We were dropping like flies. The first thing that needed to be done was an interrogation of everyone left. We needed to be 100% positive there was no other spy among us. Daryl and I would personally interview and search every person and camper here. I declared a sort of martial law until I knew we could trust every man, woman, and child left here. Anyone that wasn't a seasonal camper would draw extra scrutiny. We were at a heightened state of security from threats both outside and inside the campground. Foregoing lunch and after 4+ hours of investigating, Daryl and I both came to the conclusion that Karen had acted alone. It was a relief to be done with that, knowing there were no more threats from inside our borders. Daryl suggested I head back to my cabin to get some much-needed rest and food. I said first thing in the morning we'd devise a plan and extract revenge on Ridge Creek. Give me 48 hours and I'll be ready to lead us into war, I said to Daryl. He replied, I only hope we have 48 hours to get ready. As I walked back to our cabin, I passed Billy and his mother's grave. It was just another constant reminder of how much the world has changed in less than 5 weeks. Dusk was fast approaching, and we kept fires, candles, and flashlights to a minimum at night, always fearful of giving our cover or position away. As I got within distance of the bridge that crossed the creek and led to our cabin, I could hear Bear barking. Bear only barked at threats and strangers. I began running over the bridge and saw Kevin, one of our members, standing behind my wife with a knife to her throat. He yelled, "Stop right there. You're close enough. I don't want to hurt her, but I will if I have to. I want the keys to your Bronco. My family isn't safe here. We want out, and we want your vehicle." His wife, Kristen, was pleading with him to stop. "If you don't shut this goddamn dog up, I'll cut her throat. I swear to God," he muttered. Now, all I was armed with was my Beretta 90 series pistol. Like I said, it was all I could shoot, and at 40 yards with one arm, I wasn't taking a shot and risking hitting my wife. "Throw me the keys and release the magazine. Kristen, go get the keys and the gun from him," Kevin yelled. Kristen begged for him to stop. She was already emotional, being 5 to 6 months pregnant. I told Kevin, "You can have the keys, the truck, and my gun. Just do not harm my wife." "Go get the gun and keys," he again commanded his wife. I followed his orders and unloaded the gun, after quickly debating if I should take his wife hostage. I couldn't do that to a pregnant woman, who obviously wanted no part of this. I placed both the keys and the gun down on the ground. I took 5 steps back. I said, "Let her go. You got what you wanted." Kristen, visibly shaken and upset, whispered, "I'm sorry," as she retrieved the keys and the pistol. "Let her go," I again yelled to Kevin. "I'm afraid I can't do that. She's coming with us until I know we're clear and out of here," he said. "No, you're not going to do that. You got everything you wanted." "I'm not asking you, Brian. I'm telling you the bitch is coming with us." My youngest was in tears, hysterical, wondering if this was the last time she'd see her mother. Through the dusk, I could see my oldest with her hand at the top of her pants pocket, gripping her cold steel recon knife. Before I could react, she lunged at Kevin, stabbing him in his neck. As he struggled to remove it, my wife broke free, pulled my youngest to safety. Bear immediately attacked and pounced on Kevin. Kristen collapsed to the ground in shock of the scene. I ran over, grabbed the gun and magazine, loaded it, and was ready to terminate Kevin. It was too late. The knife wound must have struck his carotid artery on the right side of his neck. He was dead, and Bear had done quite the number on his face. Having the only set of wheels had put a giant target on myself and my family. I hugged my wife and daughters, thankful all of us were unharmed. 34 days in, and at the age of 15, my daughter had taken her first life. A heavy burden to bear for someone who didn't even have a driver's license yet. I told her, "I'm sorry you had to do that." She replied to me, "I did what was necessary. Don't be sorry, Dad." Where Karen had most likely lied about being a battered spouse, I had the intuition Kristen actually lived it. As my wife tended to her while she was still unconscious on the ground, she noticed bruises on both arms and a swollen top lip. I heard Daryl's voice call out to me that we had a visitor approach who says he knows you. I turned to look back in the direction his voice came from and saw Joe standing next to him. Daryl asked what happened to Kevin and Kristen. I let my wife explain the events that had transpired, and I ran to embrace Joe. His once clean-cut face now had a thick, unkempt beard. He looked about 10 to 15 pounds lighter since I'd last seen him 6 long days ago. So much had happened and changed since we evacuated my house on day 28. Joe said he was forced out of our neighborhood 3 days ago. One of the government contract workers had shown back up to his house injured after Russian forces attacked and overtook the relief camp at the local high school. He told Joe the United States was fighting back slowly. Our biggest ally, the UK, had also been hit with an EMP as well. A strategic move to disable the one country who could immediately help us. The vast majority of foreign aid was coming from Australia, South Korea, and Canada. Every aircraft carrier we had overseas and supporting ships, including submarines, cruisers, destroyers, and frigates, were called home to help protect the country and help fight off the Russian and Chinese invasion. 2 days after Joe took in the government contractor, the Russians rolled out, going house to house, killing everyone they came across. After clearing each house, they lit fire to them, reducing them to rubble. My house was no longer there, he said. We had left just in time. Joe had no choice. He had to leave as well. The contractor refused to evacuate. He was severely wounded, didn't want to hinder Joe. Joe left on bike and headed this way 3 days ago. He said the vast majority of big cities on the East Coast were flattened and uninhabitable. Anyone left now had to deal with roving gangs and marauders who took whatever they wanted by any means necessary. It took Joe close to 72 hours to make the 60-plus mile trip. On day 2, he ran across a gang of 3. He was able to kill 2, but the third had taken off with his bike and his pack. I in turn explained to Joe everything that had happened at Wood Creek since I arrived. We had our own group we were fighting with in Ridge Creek. They had attacked once before I arrived, burned out our corn crops, infiltrated us with a spy who killed 5, including Alicia, and wounded myself and 1 other. We had sent someone to do recon work, and he was killed and floated back downstream to us minus his eyes. I couldn't be happier to have Joe with us. He was someone I could trust, someone I could confide in, and someone I could go to war with. It had been 5 weeks exactly today that everything changed. I could still clearly remember the exact moment it happened, where I was and what I was doing. It seemed like it was months ago, not 5 weeks ago. When the grid goes down, time stops. Minutes seem to be hours, hours seem to be days, and days seem to be weeks. I'd always seen and heard the saying that when the grid went down, 90% of the population would be dead within the first year. Living and breathing it every day, I fully believed that would unfortunately prove to be true. I'd lost all my neighbors. My daughter's best friend and her entire family were gone. And the most devastating loss was losing my own father to a senseless accident. I often wondered about the rest of my family and friends. How many of them suffered a horrific death, whether from starvation, dehydration, or murder. I felt like the stress, violence, and daily grind had aged me 10 years in the past 35 days. I estimated I lost somewhere in the vicinity of 15 to 18 pounds, judging by how my clothes now fit. 3 notches down on my belt as well. It wasn't because we didn't have enough food. It was because I was always on the go, doing something. Foregoing meals to run security, fight off an attack, chopping wood, or just burying the dead. I still hadn't kicked my nicotine habit. I was reduced to rationing my smokes to make them last. As I awoke on day 35, I knew today was the day for retaliation. My left shoulder was nowhere near 100%. But I knew Daryl was right. Injured or not, Wood Creek could not wait any longer and leave our fate to chance. With Joe in camp and by my side, it was time for us to do what we did back on day 26. 9 days ago when we terminated and extracted revenge on the group of scumbags who killed and tortured Alicia's family. Joe, Daryl, and I were set to meet up at the rec hall at 900 hours and formulate our plan. I hated the thought of leaving my family again. I had already promised them the day Joe and I set out on day 26 would be the last time I would leave them. Here I was, not even a week and a half later, and I was breaking that promise. I was the first one up in the cabin, other than Bear. I had an uneasy feeling, a knot in my stomach, at what we were going to be preparing for. I wanted to make breakfast for the girls this morning, hoping and praying it wouldn't be the last time I ever did so. I brewed some Insta coffee for my wife on the Coleman cooktop, fired up the grill outside to make them some chocolate chip pancakes. I've been saving the chocolate chips for a special occasion, and today seemed to be as good a day as any. I enjoyed my morning vice, just like I did every morning. A tall glass of cold water, and that first smoke of the day. Today was August 23rd, and in the higher elevations of the southern tier, temperatures were already dipping into the 40s at night. As I sat by the grill, waiting for the wood to catch, I looked up to the heavens. I was never the religious or praying type, but tomorrow would have been my mother's 73rd birthday. Her 10th, I'd be celebrating without her. I looked up, asked for her to watch over me today, and if anything happened to me, make sure my wife and her granddaughters would be okay. With my eyes still closed, I heard Joe's voice call out, "Morning, partner." "Good morning, G.I. Joe," I replied. Joe didn't like being called that. That was what his drill instructor in basic training referred to him by. Joe asked if I was ready for this today. With no hesitation, I replied back, "You bet your ass I am." It was a lie, though. I was nervous and uneasy, but didn't want to tell Joe. I didn't want his confidence in me wavering. Joe joined myself and my family for breakfast. My wife, who also wasn't very religious, asked to say a prayer before we ate. I could tell she was scared for what today may bring. The sight of Nate's eyeless body floating downstream had her thinking that could be me. The five of us joined hands and bowed our heads as my wife began to pray. God of our power and might, at every moment and in every place, you are near to those who call upon your name in faith. In marriage, you have blessed us with a share in your divine love. Look upon my husband and our friend Joe and keep them in your safekeeping, no matter where the road may lead. And when the battle is ended, bring them safely home to those who love them. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. I was visibly shaken from the powerful moment we had all just experienced. Tears ran down my cheeks. No one uttered a word the remainder of breakfast. We all ate in silence. At 8:45, Joe and I departed to meet Daryl at the rec hall. Joe had only shown up to Wood Creek with his AR-15 and his body armor chest plate. The rest of his supplies were lost to the one remaining marauder who managed to escape with his bike. Knowing I was wounded, Joe offered me his body armor to wear during combat. I was thankful for his offer, but declined it. He said if he wears it, then he leads us in. And he wasn't asking me. He was telling me. Daryl was already awaiting us at the rec hall. He greeted Joe and I with a firm handshake. The three of us sat down at the table to come up with Wood Creek's attack plan. We would wait for the cover of darkness to launch our mission. Joe and I would lead a team of 5 into the back of Ridge Creek while Daryl would create a distraction at their front gates. Neither Joe or I was familiar with the layout of the campsite, but Daryl was. He already had drawn up a map for us. Daryl was to retreat back to Wood Creek after creating the diversion. He was too valuable an asset to lose in a gunfight. He was our engineer and our communication guy. The 5 men Joe and I were taking were from our 12-member security patrol. The remaining 7 were to stay behind and defend Wood Creek at all costs. Joe had termed our mission the Battle of Annihilation. It was the goal of destroying our enemy in a single-planned pivotal battle. Daryl had some leftover fireworks from the 4th of July. He would set those off and launch into the front of Wood Creek. I offered them up some of my smoke grenades as well, to reduce their visibility in the chaos and cause confusion. As soon as Daryl's deception initiated, our team would come in the back and launch our attack in a flanking maneuver. I told Daryl I was armed with the shock and awe power of one remaining military grenade that I would use if we could get a large group pinned down in close quarters. The plan and agenda was agreed upon. Daryl would deliver the message to the 5 men he had selected to be part of our mission. We waited too long. Ridge Creek was on the offensive and mounting a full-on attack on our grounds. At 1000 hours, they decided to strike. They had avoided the 2 main entrances and infiltrated Wood Creek through the surrounding woods. I immediately grabbed my walkie and radioed my wife. I told her to get inside the cabin and stay low. I'm on my way. The gunshots continued to echo throughout the pines. The 3 of us headed in the direction of the disturbance. Joe, as promised, led the way with his protection of body armor. Kristen came running up to us, risking her life and the life of her unborn child, to tell us she had seen 4 men enter from the ridgeline. The same ridgeline that was directly behind the cabin my family was taking cover at. My heart sank at the thought of them taking on fire. Daryl commanded Kristen to get back to her camper and hide underneath it. I jumped in front of Joe and ran like a bat out of hell to get back there as fast as I could. We heard gunfire ringing out, now by the rec hall where we had just left. Most likely a second group of Ridge Creek members. Daryl yelled he was turning back and headed back in that direction. As we approached the bridge, there were multiple campers riddled with bullet holes. I was a good 15 to 20 feet in front of Joe, and as I began to cross the wooden bridge, shots rang up from underneath it, narrowly missing my feet. Joe opened up on the bastard hiding underneath and killed him. More shots rang down on us from the treetops on the other side. We were sitting ducks on top of this 40-foot-long bridge. We had no choice but to immediately jump over and succumb to the 12-foot drop down into the water. The good news was there was about 4 feet of water to break our fall. The bad news, the creek bed was layered with jagged and slippery rocks. We both hit the water simultaneously. My wife had witnessed the ambush taking place and with a better line of sight took aim with her own AR-15 and vanquished our treetop threat. Joe and I couldn't see it, but we heard his bolt-action rifle drop to the ground. The sniper hung from 30 feet up, still tied off to the branches he was raining down rounds from. Miraculously, Joe and I were both uninjured from the jump and preceding fall. 2 down and not sure how many threats remained inside our borders. As Joe covered us, I radioed out to Daryl, asking what the status was on his side. Daryl replied back that a second group of 4 had attacked on the rec hall side of the creek too. There were multiple casualties on our Wood Creek side. One of the 4 assailants was down and deceased. I told him we had terminated 2 on this side and wasn't sure about any casualties we had suffered. There were still 5 Ridge Creek members unaccounted for and on the loose inside of Wood Creek. I was now faced with a moral dilemma: stay and protect my family, or continue on the manhunt of the 5 remaining assassins that were still inside our camp. Without hesitation, my wife told me, go. Get them before they kill any more of us. We'll be fine here. We'll stay hunkered down inside the cabin. Don't you worry. I won't let anything happen to the girls. And just like that, Joe and I took off down the path in the direction of screams. More gunfire continued to erupt, surely resulting in more deaths. Camper after camper were left with doors flung open and riddled with bullet holes. Semi-automatic rifles and pump shotguns, I was guessing. There was gunfire coming from the public shower and bathroom building, approximately 100 yards from us. As we both approached, we stumbled across the bodies of Bud and Gladys Baker. Seasonal campers I knew from 30 years ago when I was a child, both with bullet holes to their heads. My grandmother and my mother had been close friends of theirs. The thought of them being gunned down enraged me. As we finally approached the wash house, 3 members of our West Entrance Security Patrol were already engaging 4 Ridge Creek members who had tried to take cover inside. Rounds were flying back and forth in both directions, with only the massive trunks of the pine trees giving us cover. We had arrived just in time as our guys were running low on ammunition. Combined, Joe and I had over 200 rounds of 5.56 to back up our security patrol with. I told Joe, we've got 3 options here. Keep exchanging rounds, hope they run out of ammo first, burn them out, or option 3, I toss the lone remaining grenade inside and we end this now. Joe smiled, stuck up 3 fingers. I yelled for my group to cover me, and as I got within 10 feet of the building, I pulled the pin, delivered an accurate throw through the now broken stained glass windows, and immediately hauled ass back behind cover. 5 seconds later, the explosion echoed throughout Wood Creek. The enemy gunfire ceased to exist, and I hoped all 4 inside had now met their maker. The 5 of us carefully approached. The rear wall was blown completely out. The roof had collapsed on the once 20 by 10 foot building. I told the group, we're not moving on until we pull all 4 bodies out, or find whatever's left of them. Joe said he had heard moans coming from beneath the rubble. Watch your 6, fellas, as we began digging to see where it came from. Help me, please, the man muttered. We had 1 still breathing and 3 others dead. Please, I'm sorry, help me, he again said. I didn't want to be part of this, but I had no choice. What do you mean no choice, Joe replied. The man said the leadership of Ridge Creek was using coercion and fear to force its people to fight. We are promised if we fight, our families get to eat. If we refuse, our family starves. I asked the man, how many are inside your camp? He answered 22 after the 8 of us were sent out this morning. Ryan is the leader. Him and his men decide who eats and who doesn't. I figured it was a good possibility the leadership of Ridge Creek now knows that they have a food shortage coming this winter and is using this war to cull its own population, gain new turf, and eliminate the local competition, all at the same time. The man even mentioned that cannibalism had been discussed between Ryan and his lackeys. I had one more question for him. I asked if any of these men were ex-military we were dealing with. Gasping for air, he said, no, I don't think so. They were a group of 20-somethings who showed up a week or so after the grid went down. They rose to power by force and fear. I've got no more questions, and you've got no more time to live, I replied. I placed the barrel of my AR directly on his forehead and fired 1 round into his brain. He had a piece of copper pipe from the plumbing lodged into his stomach. As far as I was concerned, I'd done him a favor and put him out of his misery. I radioed Daryl, informed him we had just terminated 4 more intruders. That left 1 unaccounted for. I told him Joe and I were going to go directly to Ridge Creek to end this war now. We had gathered intel from one of the deceased members. Now was the time to finish it. Daryl and some of the remaining security patrol would do a camper-by-camper search, looking for injuries, casualties, and any sign of the last remaining insurgent. Joe and I returned back to my cabin to reload on ammunition, supplies, and grab the map Daryl had made for us. The thought crossed my mind to drive the Bronco into hostile grounds, but we decided to go on foot through the same woods they infiltrated us by. With not so much of a goodbye to my wife and children, we headed up the ridgeline behind the cabin to make the 1.5-mile hike to the enemy's perimeter. The initial attack happened less than 2 hours ago at 1000 hours. I asked Joe if he trusted and believed the intel we had just received. He answered, "It didn't matter. We take out the leadership, and then we'll decide the fate of the rest. We need to be on high alert, keep our eyes open for any booby traps they may have deployed on this trail." No more than 30 paces, Joe told me to stop. There was a 4-foot hole dug out with razor-sharp sticks pointing up, covered by some pine branches. The kind of thing that could put a real hurting on an unsuspecting person, or make a meal out of some unassuming prey. Daryl radioed in on the walkies and said he had recovered a walkie off one of their dead. He said whoever was leading Ridge Creek was trying to make contact with the group they had sent out on their suicide mission. He said they sounded desperate and were falling further into denial when he received no response back. "Now is your chance," Daryl said. "Get in there before they send more our way." We were less than a half-mile out from our destination. Joe had picked out and noticed tracks going back and forth in each direction. This obviously wasn't the first time Ridge Creek had made this trip. He figured they had been scouting our camp for weeks. Seconds later, we both heard a single gunshot echo out from their camp. "Double time," Joe whispered. As we winded our way through the bordering woods, we could hear a voice yelling. "Who's next?" the man said. "Either you comply and fight for me, or you die." I assumed that was Ryan, the leader, who was executing Ridge Creek members one by one who refused to step up and go on the next suicide mission for him. There was a man on his knees in front of him, pleading, begging for his life. Ryan was standing in front of him with a pistol pointed at his forehead. Joe had seen enough. He braced his AR on a tree branch, using it as a rest. Took aim some 100+ yards away. He took a few breaths in and slowly exhaled each time. 2 separate shots rang out. The first was Ryan executing the man that was on his knees. The second was Joe's 5.56 green tip that penetrated Ryan's left eye, dropping him immediately to the ground. "Damn it," Joe said. He flinched on me when he fired that pistol. I was aiming square for his forehead. I knew Joe was an Army vet, but it wouldn't be until later that day I would find out he was infantry, the backbone of the Army who defended our country against any threat by land, as well as capturing, destroying, and repelling enemy ground forces. The engaging gunshot set off a panic inside their camp. Bodies were ducking and hiding for cover. Return fire began coming in the direction they thought the round came from. But by now, Joe and I had moved, and they were wasting precious rounds, pumping them into the trees. I deployed 2 cans of smoke grenades into the camp, adding to the chaos that was ensuing. Joe shouted out, "Shoot anything that moves." Ryan had 2 guys that worked directly under him, and they were the only 2 Ridge Creek members returning fire on us. Under the cover of the green smoke, Joe had terminated one of them. That left one more against Joe and I. As the cloud of smoke dissipated, we watched in horror as the last remaining assailant started executing his own people. With multiple bodies down and no more ammunition in his rifle, he reached for the pistol Ryan had used and pointed it directly at the side of his head, pulling the trigger, all while staring at Joe and I. He took the cowardly way out rather than face us. Joe quickly recovered the 3 weapons, and I counted an additional 10 bodies that Ryan and his crew gunned down in cold blood. I called out to any remaining Ridge Creek survivors, step out now, and you'll live. If we have to come find you, I promise you, we'll kill you. I know that not everyone here agreed with Ryan and what he was doing to us at Wood Creek. That's why I'm giving you all one chance, and one chance only, to step forward, unarmed, and live to see another day. All of a sudden, one by one, 9 emaciated bodies of 7 men and 2 women complied with my warning. They all looked abnormally thin because of the lack of food. Even though they were all gaunt, they were the fortunate ones who had not been killed and would now have a second chance. Joe and I both knew bringing them back with us was the humane and compassionate thing to do. It was clear that this camp was run by intimidation and fear. They were not all evil and malevolent people here. As dusk was approaching, Joe made contact with Daryl. He told him the threat has been terminated. We have 9 refugees who are returning with us. Bring the tractor and wagon. Let's all get them out of here and go home.